Poseidon, god of the sea, spent 1 full year as the slave of a mortal king. There was no disguise, and no trick of shape, and no bargain that let him watch from a distance. He carried stone. The block came up the ramp on wet ropes, and Poseidon set his shoulder into it and pushed. The rope opened the skin of his palms the way it opens the palms of any man on any building site. Dust settled into the sweat on his forearms and dried there in a gray crust at the elbow. The block was limestone, cut on the ridge above the plain, and it weighed more than the men beside him could have shifted together. He set his feet and the ropes went tight. The thing moved the width of a hand, and then it moved again. Above him, on the finished course, a foreman leaned over the edge and shouted at him to move faster because the light was going and the mortar was setting wrong. He moved faster. So who holds enough authority to put the god of the ocean on a work crew and hurry him along? His own brother. Zeus passed the sentence and sent him down to serve a Trojan king named Laomedon for 1 year at a wage the two sides agreed on. What Poseidon raised in that year was the wall of Troy. That wall held through 10 years of siege. A wall like that settles a war before the war starts. The best fighters of an entire generation came to that plain with unlimited motivation and a decade to spend, and none of them ever got through the stonework. For 10 years, they could not take that city by force. The greatest army the poets ever remembered sat outside one fortification for 10 years and could not solve it. It was built by somebody who could not be beaten at building. When it finally gave, it gave in one place only, and the reason was built into it while he worked. Troy is remembered for a wooden horse. The wound that let the horse matter was opened by a wage a king refused to pay. Now go back before the ropes, to a rope of a different kind. On Olympus, in the dark, 3 of the great powers stood over a sleeping Zeus with cord in their hands, and the plan was to bind him where he lay. Hera had built it. Athena had agreed to it. Poseidon was the 3rd pair of hands, and his presence matters because the only reason to bind the king of the gods is that somebody intends to replace him. They very nearly did it. What stopped them was a sea nymph named Thetis. She went down into the deep, came back up with a creature of 100 hands, and set him at the foot of the throne. The gods looked at those hands and did not touch the cord again. Zeus woke to find out who had been holding it. Now move forward, past the sentence, past the year, past the wall, into the middle of a war on the Trojan plain, with the dust so thick the sun goes brown behind it. 2 gods stand facing each other in that dust, and neither one is fighting yet. Poseidon looks at Apollo, who is standing on the Trojan side, and asks him how he can possibly defend that city after what its king did to them both. Then he tells the story, out loud, on the battlefield, in front of everyone, because he has been carrying it for a generation, and it has not cooled. He says that Zeus sent them both down to Laomedon for 1 year, for a fixed price. The king set the terms himself. Poseidon built the wall. Apollo took the herds up onto the wooded ridges of Ida and kept them. And when the year was finished, the 2 of them came to be paid. Laomedon looked at the wall he had just been given, the wall no army on earth could climb, and refused. That is the moment the whole rest of this film comes out of. A mortal was handed the labor of 2 gods, and he decided that a promise made to something he could not see was not a debt. He did not stop at refusing. Laomedon told them what he would do if they argued. He would tie them hand and foot, both of them, and put them on a ship, and sell them in the islands far away where nobody would come looking. And before that, he said, he would cut the ears off both their heads. That threat had a shape. Selling is a business transaction, and business can be undone. Cutting is permanent, and it is done to a face, and it is done so that everyone who sees you afterwards knows exactly what you are. He said it to the god of the sea, standing on ground that the sea surrounds on 3 sides. Poseidon said nothing back. Apollo said nothing back. The 2 of them turned and walked out of Troy without their wage. That silence is the most dangerous thing in this entire story, because gods who answer immediately are finished with you. Gods who walk away are keeping the account open. And the account stayed open a very long time. First the water came. The tide went wrong along the whole Trojan coast, took the fields inland, and left the ground salted behind it. Then something came in out of that water that the city could not kill. The only price it would accept was the king's own daughter, chained to a rock on the shore where her father could watch. Then a strong man named Heracles came through, and Laomedon made a second agreement, in front of witnesses, with a stranger who could actually solve the problem. He broke that one too. He had learned only one lesson from the first time, which was that nothing had happened to him yet. What happened next was that Troy fell, the first time, to a force small enough to fit in 6 ships. Laomedon died inside his own gates, and almost every son he had died with him. The one boy who survived that day survived because he was ransomed, bought back like goods, and he grew up to run the city you know. So the Troy that stands at the beginning of the war you already know about, the one with the towers and the treasury and the 50 sons, is a rebuilt city. It is run by a man who was purchased as a child, and it stands behind a wall a god was cheated out of building. Every part of it is inherited from a bill that was never settled, and when the Greeks finally came, Poseidon fought against Troy with a coldness that surprised the other gods. To him, the 10 years on the plain were a collection, and the woman was somebody else's reason for being there. He had waited through a whole generation of Trojan kings for a city to be pulled down, and the pulling down was overdue. All of it comes back to the man on the ramp with rope burns on his hands. To feel how far that fall goes, you have to see the height it started from. This was the god who split the seabed for a bet and put a saltwater spring on the rock of Athens as an opening offer. This was the second son of the same father, the one who drew the sea when the 3 brothers divided the universe. He stated in front of witnesses that he was Zeus's equal by birth and took orders from nobody. He had shaken cities apart with the ground under them. He had made horses out of nothing, and he had come within one turn of the cord, one movement of one hand, of taking the sky itself. That is the part that gets left out of the story. It looks very much as though Zeus handed him to a mortal, because the cord in Poseidon's hand had come one movement short of working. A brother who almost succeeds will always be measured for a second attempt. Aegis lies on the floor of the sea, and the palace Poseidon keeps there is built of gold that salt water cannot touch. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and arrived on the 4th. The mountains shook as he went, and the forests on them shook, under feet that were never meant to walk on land. In the stable under the water, he harnessed 2 horses, with hooves of bronze and manes of gold. He put gold on his own body. He took up a whip of worked gold and stepped into the car. The sea opened for him. Water gets out of the way of a ship grudgingly and closes again behind it. This water came apart in front of the horses because it recognized who was driving. The creatures of the deep came up out of their hiding places along the whole length of that road to watch him pass. The horses ran on the surface, and the bronze axle underneath them stayed dry. That is the being who would later be shouted at from the top of a half-finished wall. In the last year of the Trojan War, when the gods finally came down onto the plain to fight each other directly, Poseidon set his feet and pulled at the ground. Deep under everything, in the dark where the dead are kept, Hades came off his throne and screamed. The Lord of the Dead was not afraid of losing a battle. He was afraid that his brother would tear the floor of the world open above him and let daylight into the place where the dead are kept. He said out loud that the sight of it would sicken even the gods. That is the scale. One god braced himself on the upper world, and the ruler of the dead ran out of his own hall in terror of what was about to happen to the ceiling. Nothing Poseidon did that day was aimed at his brother underground. The ground simply moved because he was standing on it. The pattern that decides everything later shows up first in a property dispute. The land around Argos was claimed by 2 powers at the same time. Hera wanted it, Poseidon wanted it. The case went to arbitration, and the arbitrators were the river gods of that country, with a river named Inachus at the head of them, and they found for Hera. Poseidon did not appeal the ruling. He did not threaten the judges or argue the merits. He went to every river that had voted against him and took the water out of it. The streams of Argos ran dry. The land became a place where the rivers vanish in summer and the ground cracks open, and it stayed that way. In the dry months, those beds were white stone with nothing moving in them, and the herds had to be walked to whatever water was left. Rivers that judge against the sea do not get to be rivers. Much later, he let water come back into that country, at Lerna, in springs that had not been there before. The water returned as a favor, at a time of his choosing, to somebody he had decided to be generous to. Both halves of that story are the same God. He works quietly. He removes the thing you need and waits to see how you like living without it. Those rivers stayed exactly where they had always been, dry, running through the middle of the country they were supposed to serve. Everybody in Argos could walk down and look at the beds of them any day they wanted. The method is identical in the middle of a war. On the beach at Troy, with the Greek line breaking, Poseidon walked among the exhausted men wearing the face and voice of an old prophet they trusted. He touched two of them with his staff. The strength came into them the way heat comes into metal. They went back into the fighting, able to do things they could not do a minute earlier. Then he left. One of the men he had touched, a fighter named Aias, watched the old prophet walk away. He understood what had just happened. The legs and feet of a god moving away from you do not look like the legs and feet of a man. He told the others they had been handled by something. Poseidon never announced himself. He changed the outcome and let them work out afterwards who had been standing next to them. There was one day in that war when he stopped being quiet about it. He came out in front of the Greek line with a long sword in his hand, and the poem says the blade looked like lightning, and no man could go near it. Then he opened his mouth. The sound that came out of Poseidon that day is measured in the text by comparison, because there is no other way to put a size on it. It was the noise that 9,000 or 10,000 men make when they run at each other in a battle. One voice did that. Every fighter on that beach felt it arrive in the middle of his chest, and a Greek line that had been coming apart all morning stood up and went forward. That is the same being who spent a year taking instructions on a building site without once raising his voice. And when the order came down from above to stop, he obeyed. That detail matters more than any of the miracles. In the 10th year of the war, a messenger named Iris came down to the Greek beach. She stood on the sand and delivered an instruction from Zeus, word for word. Poseidon was to leave the battlefield and go back to the water. What came back out of him was a description of the insult. He said that he had been spoken to as though he were a servant to be moved from place to place. He said the message had arrived with threats attached, and that nobody sent threats to him. Then he stopped himself, and he gave a reason for stopping that had nothing to do with fear. He said that the two of them had come from the same mother, and that Zeus had come first. He would yield to the years between them, and to nothing else in the message. Then he added a condition, quietly, in front of the messenger. If Troy was allowed to survive against his will, there would be a resentment between the two of them that would never heal. This is a God who obeys the order in front of witnesses and files the grievance in the same breath. 10 years into a war, he is still chasing a debt from a building site. Everything in this account was true before the year of servitude, and true again afterwards. The strides that shook the mountains, the horses on the water, the rivers punished for a verdict, the hand on the shoulder in the fighting. None of it was taken away permanently. He got all of it back the moment his year with Laomedon ended, which is exactly why what happened to him is so strange. Zeus did not destroy him and did not want to. Zeus wanted him to spend 1 year learning the difference between having that power and not having it. Then he wanted him back at full strength, in the same hall, at the same rank, with the memory attached. That is a very specific thing to do to your own brother. You only do it to a brother you cannot afford to lose, and cannot afford to trust. The oldest poem we have names the three who put their hands on the cord that night. It says what they meant to do, and how close they came. Then it goes quiet about the only question worth asking. The sea already had everything the sea could hold. So what was Poseidon supposed to be getting out of it? The way we know about the plot at all is that somebody used it as leverage. Early in the morning, On the highest peak of Olympus, a sea nymph named Thetis came up out of the water and found Zeus sitting alone. She knelt and took hold of his knees with her left hand. She put her right hand under his chin. That grip is the posture of a person asking for something they intend to get. It pins the one being asked in place while the request is made. She wanted a favor for her son, and she knew the favor was large, so she opened with a reminder. She asked him to remember the day the other gods wanted to tie him up, and who had stopped it. That is the whole record. The oldest poem in the language spends about 5 lines on the closest anyone ever came to overthrowing the king of the gods. It spends them inside a piece of quiet blackmail delivered by a mother on behalf of her child. The 3 names she gave him back all belong to the same household. Hera was his wife. Athena was his daughter. Poseidon was his brother. Nobody from outside the family is in that list. No titan, no monster, no rival power from another mountain. The attempt on Zeus was made by the 3 people closest to him. 2 of them shared his table every evening, and one of them had come out of his own head. The poem never says how they planned to do it, and that silence is part of the story. Zeus does not sleep the way a man sleeps. His weapon does not have to be carried anywhere. It arrives, and there is no distance at which a person is safe from it. To bind him, you would need him unconscious. You would need every limb covered at once, and you would need nobody to hesitate. 3 sets of hands is the minimum number for that job. 1 power holds the arms, 1 holds the legs, and 1 works the cord. All 3 have to be strong enough that the middle of the operation never depends on speed. Any one of them hesitating for a second turns the whole thing into the worst decision the 3 of them ever made. The plan also required them to agree with each other, which in that family is its own miracle. Hera and Athena were rarely on the same side of anything, and Poseidon spent most of his existence in an argument with somebody. Hera brought the plan, and Athena brought the judgment. Poseidon brought the only pair of arms on Olympus that could hold Zeus down for the seconds the other 2 would need. Take Poseidon out of it, and there is no attempt. That is why Thetis was able to sell the story to Zeus as her own achievement. She had not fought anybody. She had gone down into the deep water and come back up with one of the 100-handed ones. The gods called him Briareus, and men called him Aegion. The poem says he was stronger than his own father. Then she walked him up the mountain. He sat down beside Zeus. That is all he did. Nobody ever explained how Thetis knew where to find him, or why one of the oldest things in the universe came up out of the water because a sea nymph asked politely. The poem hands over the fact and moves on. The balance of power on Olympus was decided by one person knowing the right name. He did not speak, and he did not lift anything, and nobody was struck. The 100-handed one sat next to the throne and enjoyed the fact that he was sitting there. The gods who had come to bind Zeus looked at what was beside him and put the cords away. The strongest conspiracy in the history of the universe ended without a blow being landed, because of where somebody was allowed to sit. Then everybody went back to normal, and normal on Olympus means the injured party takes his time. If you want to know what Zeus does with people who work against him, that household already had a demonstration on file, and everyone in the room had watched it. Hera had crossed him once before over the treatment of a mortal. He hung her out of the sky. He put a golden band around her wrists and tied 2 anvils to her ankles, so that her own weight would do most of the work. He left her swinging in the open air between the clouds and the earth, where every immortal alive could see her. The gods came and stood at the edge and could do nothing. On another day, her son crossed him over the same woman. Hephaestus took hold of his mother in the middle of that quarrel. Zeus took hold of him by the foot and threw him off the threshold of heaven. He fell for an entire day. He was still falling at sunset, and he came down on the island of Lemnos with almost nothing left in him, and the local people picked him up. His legs never worked properly again. Every immortal alive had watched both of those punishments happen and had done nothing about either of them. That is the standing law of that house. It was never written down anywhere, and everybody understood it perfectly. Every time he crossed a room after that, the room watched a god limp and remembered exactly why. So the 3 who reached for the cords knew the going rate before they started. They reached for them anyway. And here is the part that turns this from a story about a failed coup into a story about a debt. Nothing visible happened to any of them. There was no trial on the mountain, no sentence read out, no anvils. The poem moves on to other things within a few lines and never comes back to the question of what the three of them paid. Athena kept her place at his side and kept his weapon on her shoulder in the war that came later. Hera kept her seat and kept arguing with him to his face. And Poseidon, at some point after that night, was stripped of all of it. He was put on a work site in the Troad, taking instructions from a man with a sunburn and a schedule. The poem does not connect those two facts in a single sentence, because the poem never explains anything in a single sentence. It puts them in the same house and lets you count. A brother tries to tie you down and comes within one moment of managing it. The brother is too strong to destroy and too dangerous to forgive. There is nobody above you to appeal to, and no cell that would hold him, and no punishment in the world that a god would even feel. So you take away the one thing he has never once been without. You hand him to the smallest, most ordinary authority you can find, and you tell him it lasts 1 year. The morning on the peak ended like this. When Thetis finished asking, Zeus sat there and said nothing for a long time. Then he agreed, and he bent his head to seal it, and the movement of that head shook the whole mountain. He was still the one who could nod and make the earth move. Down in the hall that evening, the same family sat down to eat together, his wife across from him and his daughter beside him. The argument started before the cups were filled. His son with the ruined legs went around the table pouring wine and telling everybody to let it go. They laughed at the sight of him working the room, and the laughter held the evening together. Every single one of them knew what had been tried. Every single one of them knew it had never been settled. And one seat at that table belonged to a god who was about to find out that his brother had been thinking about it for a very long time. The removal happened somewhere nobody wrote down, and the poem gives it 4 words. Zeus sent them to serve for 1 year for an agreed price to a mortal. What that means in practice is easier to see than to say. Poseidon walked down off the mountain and put his foot on ordinary ground, and the ground stayed exactly where it was. No tremor went out from the step. The trees along the road did not move, and no water anywhere turned toward him. There was nothing at the edge of his hearing that had been there every second of his existence until that morning. He was still the same size and the same shape and the same face. Everything behind the face had been switched off and left in his brother's keeping for the length of a year. Then he walked, because walking was now the only way he had of getting anywhere. The second god on that road was Apollo. He was serving a sentence of his own for a thing he had done, in a story that belongs to a different film. The two of them came into the Troad as a pair of workmen looking for a season of paid work, which is exactly what they were. They found the king of that country on a building site with a plan he could not afford. Laomedon wanted a wall around his city, a real one, the kind that decides wars before they start. He had the stone and the ground and no way to raise it. 2 strangers came in and offered to do the whole thing inside 1 year for a fixed sum. He looked at them, agreed, and set the terms himself. A mortal king wrote the contract that the god of the sea worked under. A wage does something to a god that no amount of heavy lifting can do. Everything that lives in the water belongs to Poseidon by right, and nothing in his life had ever come to him as payment for hours. Now there was a number attached to him. Somebody had worked out what a year of his labor was worth in metal, and had said the figure out loud, and he had accepted it. The number is the whole humiliation. He was no longer a power that things happened around. He was an expense on a king's list, sitting between the price of the stone and the cost of feeding the men who moved it. Laomedon divided the two of them the way you divide any pair of hired men. He put Apollo up on the wooded slopes of Ida with the cattle, days from anybody, doing the oldest and dullest job in the world. He kept Poseidon down on the site, where the actual work was. Every morning the god of the sea went out to a hole in the ground and made it deeper. The foundation trench came first. It had to go down until the base of it hit something that would never shift, because a wall is only ever as good as the part nobody sees. Then the stone came, cut on the ridge and dragged down on rollers. Each block had to be dressed by hand until its face sat flush against the face of the one before it. He worked the courses upward. His hands changed. Skin that had never had a reason to harden, hardened, and the salt in his sweat dried white on his forearms in the heat of the afternoons. Winter came, and the mortar had to be nursed through the cold. Spring came, and the level rose past the height of a man, then past the height of two. The season turned the way seasons turn for laborers everywhere, in a series of identical days that all end with the light going and something still unfinished. There is a particular kind of tiredness that only comes out of repetition, and he learned it that year. A stone dressed on one morning is exactly like a stone dressed on the next. The work never becomes interesting, and nobody watching can tell the difference between the man who cares about it and the man who does not. Up on the high pasture, Apollo was learning the same lesson with animals. He moved the herds onto grass and off it before it was ruined, kept the young ones alive through the cold, and counted them twice a day for 12 months. Neither of them was allowed to be good at anything else for the length of that year. Two of the largest forces in the universe worked at a level of skill that any competent countryman already had, and the country never noticed either of them. What he did with that year decides everything that comes afterwards. He built it perfectly. He put the wall up wide and beautiful, on purpose, to a standard nobody had asked for and nobody could have enforced. The city standing behind it would be impossible to break. Nothing obliged him to do that. He was a prisoner on a work detail with his power confiscated, working for a man he owed nothing. The easiest revenge available to him was a bad wall with a soft seam in it that would open in the first serious siege. Any resentful builder in history would have taken that option. Poseidon could not take it. Something in him was unable to put his hands on a piece of work and produce anything less than the best thing of its kind on earth. So the greatest fortification in the ancient imagination went up around a city that had done nothing to deserve it, raised by a god who was being punished. The wall was his signature. He signed it because he could not sign anything else. Up on Ida, Apollo spent the same 12 months with the herds on the high pasture, and the two sentences ran side by side without touching. Two of the great powers of the universe spent a full year inside the borders of one small kingdom. It used them the way it would have used any two men who needed the money. The people of Troy walked past the wall every day and watched it get taller. Nobody on that site knew who was laying it. Somebody handed him bread at midday, the same as everybody else. Somebody complained to him about the heat and got an answer. Those conversations are somewhere underneath every stone of that wall. There is no version of this story in which anybody comes up to Poseidon and asks him a single question about himself. And through all of it, the arrangement held, because there was a wage at the end. That is what made the year survivable. It is the only reason a being of that rank could take instructions on a work site without the whole thing turning into something else. Whatever Zeus had ordered, the arrangement with Laomedon was still a contract. A price had been agreed in front of witnesses. The season was moving toward the day when the work would be finished and the sum would be handed over. At that moment, the year would close and become a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening. Every hour of that labor was carried by a promise made by a man. One more thing happened on that site before the year ended. The wall was not finished by two gods working alone. Near the end, a third pair of hands came onto the site, invited, and those hands belonged to somebody who could die. There was a reason the invitation was made, and the reason was a good one at the time. But it meant that the greatest wall ever built had one stretch in it laid by a man. The difference between that stretch and the rest was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Something came out of the grass on the day that section was finished, in front of witnesses, and it told them exactly what that seam was going to mean. With the wall almost closed, Poseidon crossed the water to an island called Aegina to collect a passenger. The man he came for was a king there named Aeacus. He was worth the trip because he had a reputation nobody else in that generation had. Aeacus was the man other people asked to settle their arguments. When a dispute went past the point where either side would give way, they came to him and accepted whatever he said. That is a very rare thing to be. He was also mortal in the ordinary way. He would get old, and he would slow down, and one day he would stop. Two strangers came up from the shore to his house and asked him to come and work for them. He said yes, and he went, and neither of them told him why he had been chosen. Two gods took a mortal king out of his own country and carried him across the sea to a building site in the Troad to lay one section of the strongest wall on earth. The reason they did it is the coldest thing in this entire story. It had already been settled, somewhere above all three of them, that Troy would one day burn. A wall made only by gods has no way in. There is no gate in it that can be forced, no stretch that can be undermined, and no course anywhere along its length that a ram would ever find. That kind of wall would have kept the city standing forever, and forever was not what had been decided. So a weakness had to be installed on purpose, by the same hands that were building the thing. The only material in the universe that reliably produces weakness is a human being. Aeacus was brought onto that site as the flaw. He did not know that, and he worked well, and there is something unbearable about the picture of him doing it. A grown man, a king in his own country, worked in the heat beside two colleagues he could not possibly match. He kept his courses level and his faces true, because he did not want to be the one who let the job down. He slept at night because he had to. He ate, and his back hurt in the mornings, and his hands split and healed and split again over the weeks. His hands were slower than theirs, and he knew it. He watched two colleagues set stone at a speed no man has ever matched, and he did not ask them how. A working man does not ask that kind of question out loud on somebody else's site. He kept up as well as a mortal can keep up. He took longer over his joints because he had to. He checked his own courses twice, and he stayed out there in the evenings after the other two had stopped. He built the best wall a man could build. Every stone he set was doing the job it had been chosen for, which was to be slightly less than the stone on either side of it. His section closed. The wall was finished. And on the day it was finished, in front of all three of them, the ground gave its answer. 3 serpents came up out of the grass at the foot of the new stonework, gray and fast, and went straight up at the wall. 2 of them struck the divine sections. Those 2 did not get a body length off the ground. They came off the stone and dropped, and they were dead where they landed, and nothing had struck them at all. Both bodies stayed there in the dirt at the base of the divine work, in the sun, while the noise the third one had made faded out somewhere over the rooftops inside. The third serpent went at the length that Aeacus had laid. It got over. It made a sound going over that everybody standing there heard, and it was gone into the city, and the sound stayed in the air after it. Nobody had to explain the shape of that. Apollo explained it anyway, because he was the one who did the explaining, and he said it out loud to the man standing next to him. Troy would be taken. It would be taken at exactly the point where Aeacus had put his hands, and it would be taken by his own family, twice, in the first generation of his descendants, and again in the fourth. That sentence was handed to him with the mortar still wet on his own work. Aeacus had come out to do an honest job for 2 gods who asked. He was told, in front of them, that the wall he had just finished was the door his own grandchildren would come through. He had been used in advance for a demolition that would happen after he was dead. The record does not say a single word about what his face did. He went home to his island afterwards and lived a long life, and he was remembered as the most upright man of his generation. He had children, and he raised them, and every one of them was a step closer to the day that had just been described to him. There is no record of him ever telling any of them about the serpents. Put Poseidon in that moment, because everything he had spent the year doing was rearranged around him in a matter of seconds. He had built it wide and beautiful. He had gone past anything an employer could have demanded, for a city he had no reason to love. A thing made by his hands could not be made badly. And at the end of that year, the finished object had one section in it that would fail. It was there because the gods themselves had arranged for it. Every course he had laid perfectly was now, in a sense, decoration. The wall would never be beaten. It would be entered, at the low point, at the place he had personally permitted, by people who would climb it while the rest of it held. He had built the strongest structure in the world with his own hands, and had watched somebody install the ending into it. That is a strange thing to carry around, and he carried it for a very long time. What was left to him out of the whole year was the wage, which was the one part of the arrangement that no prophecy had interfered with. There is one more piece of that afternoon worth having, and it has nothing to do with prophecy. The two serpents died because the wall was too good. Both of them went at stone that a god had set, at full speed, and the stone simply declined to be a problem. That means the wall worked. Whatever else was true about that year, the thing Poseidon made did exactly what he made it to do. It did it in front of witnesses, on the first day of its life, twice over. The city inside it was now the safest city on earth. Laomedon had bought himself a fortress that would hold off the entire Greek world for 10 years. He had bought it at a price he set himself, from workers who finished on schedule and delivered far past the contract. Everything about the project had gone well for him. That is the position the king was in on the morning the work stopped. The site went quiet, and the two of them washed the dust off their hands and walked up to the palace to be paid. The hall was full when they came in, because a king settles his accounts in public. Laomedon sat at the end of it with his household around him. The two men who had built his wall stood in front of the room like any other contractors at the end of a job. One of them had put up the stonework the whole city was living behind. The other had brought the royal herds down off the mountain, fattened, over the same 12 months, and had lost none of them. They asked for the sum that had been agreed, which was to be paid in gold, at a figure the king had named himself in front of his own people. There was a pause in the room, and in that pause the king decided how the rest of his life was going to go. He told them there had been no such agreement. That is the detail that turns this from a swindle into something else, and it comes down to us through more than one source. He did not plead poverty, and he did not ask for time, and he did not offer them half. He looked at two men who had worked for him for 1 year, in front of witnesses who had watched them do it. He denied that the promise had ever been made. He swore it. He put an oath on top of the lie, which in that world meant offering the gods themselves as guarantors of a story about cheating gods. The wall was standing outside the window while he said it. Everyone in the room could see it from where they stood. The arithmetic of the thing is worth doing once. 1 year of work by 2 workers on a project that would have taken an ordinary crew a generation, delivered inside the agreed season to a standard no inspection could fault. Against that stands 1 payment in gold. It comes out of a treasury that had just been made permanently safe by the object in question. The king was being asked to hand over a fraction of what he had gained. Nobody in that hall would have called the price unfair, because the price had come out of his own mouth 12 months earlier. And then, because the two of them did not move, the king went further. He told them what would happen to them if they kept standing there. He would have them tied, hands and feet, so that neither could work loose on the journey. He would put them on a ship and sell them in the islands out past the edge of anything, where a man goes and is never traced. And before they went, he would take their ears off with a bronze blade, so that the price would be lower and the ownership would be obvious. You already know that threat. What matters is the room it was set in. There were people standing along both walls of that hall, guards and stewards and members of his own family. Every one of them heard a king promise mutilation to 2 laborers who had asked for their pay. Nobody said anything. Nobody stepped forward, and nobody went to the door, and nobody came to find those 2 men afterwards to tell them it had been shameful. The court of Troy watched the whole thing, and went back to its evening. The ears were the part with a purpose. Selling a man is a transaction, and transactions can be reversed. A person who is sold can be bought back, and can walk into a room afterwards and be believed. Cutting a man's ears off is permanent, and it is done to the face, and it follows him for the rest of his life. It tells everyone who ever looks at him that he was owned, and it is the standard mark for a runaway. Nobody argues with a man who wears it. Nobody lends to him, and nobody takes his word against his masters. In a world without documents, a man's standing lives entirely in his face and his reputation, and both of those can be taken off him in an afternoon with 1 blade and 2 cuts. That is why the threat was chosen. It was the cheapest available way of making 2 inconvenient creditors permanently unable to collect from anybody, ever again, anywhere in the world. Laomedon was doing something more deliberate than threatening pain. He was proposing to write his version of events onto their bodies permanently, so that no account of what happened in his hall could ever be told by them and believed. He was destroying the witnesses without killing them. Poseidon said nothing. Apollo said nothing. The two of them turned around and walked out of the hall, and out of the palace, and down through the city they had spent the year fortifying. People were in the streets doing ordinary evening things as the two of them came down through the town. Nobody looked twice at a pair of workmen leaving at the end of a contract. They went out through the gate in the wall they had built. The road down from the city to the sea is not long. They walked it at the pace of two men with nowhere in particular to be. Anybody passing them would have taken them for what they looked like, which is a pair of workers let go at the end of a contract. That walk is the exact center of this story. A god who had laid every course of that stonework with his own hands passed underneath it on his way out with nothing. The thing standing over his head was the finest work he had ever done. It now belonged to a man who had just offered to take a blade to his face. He did not put a hand on the wall as he passed it. He did not turn around at the gate. The rage stayed inside, where it did the most damage, and the two of them went off down the road without a word between them. Laomedon watched two workmen leave his city with empty hands and considered the matter closed. From where he sat, he had run a clean operation. He had wanted the strongest wall in the world, and he had got it, inside 1 year. At the end of it, he had discovered that his suppliers had no way to enforce the contract. Men without land and without a name have no court to go to. He had made his calculation from the only information he had, which was what he could see. What he could see was two tired workmen in dusty clothes. The year ended a short time after that. It ended the way a sentence ends, at a fixed point, with nothing needed from anybody to make it happen. Somewhere on the road out of the Troad, the weight came back into Poseidon, all at once, the way water comes back into a dry channel. The hearing came first, that low constant awareness of every wave on every coast in the world. Then the reach, then the weight, then the certainty. He stopped walking. Down at the shore, the water changed its rhythm along the whole line of that coast. The ships that were out on it that afternoon felt the change happen and had no idea what it was. He was himself again, standing on a road outside a city that had just refused to pay him and that had described out loud what it intended to do to his body. And Laomedon, at that moment, was inside his walls, having his evening meal, ruling the safest kingdom on earth. The sea came for the farmland first. Poseidon put the water over the whole coastal plain of the Troad and held it there. That ground had been growing grain since before anyone could remember. Every field between the city and the shore went under. The animals that could run went inland, and the ones that could not stood in water up to their bellies until they stopped standing. When it drew back off the land, it left the ground white and useless, and nothing would take root in it afterwards. The season was gone, and the season after it was gone as well. That was the harvest of a kingdom, taken in an afternoon, by a creditor who had decided to start collecting. Then the sickness came into the city, and that part was Apollo's contribution. The record is short about it, and the short version is enough. People began dying in their houses at a rate the priests could not keep up with, and the smoke over the burials was visible from the wall. Two gods were being paid, in the only currency that was available, out of a population that had never been consulted about any of it. And then something came up out of the water. It came in on the flood, and it worked the low ground where the fields used to be, and it took people. The accounts do not describe it in detail, which is the most frightening thing about them. What they record is behavior. It came up the drowned fields, took whoever was out there, and went back into the water. Then it did the same thing again, and there was nothing anybody could do about the schedule. Men went out with what they had, because men always do, and none of that made any difference. After a while, nobody went down to the shore at all. The city changed shape around that fact. Roads that had been busy every morning went quiet, and the market thinned out. The families who had lived on the low ground moved in with relatives inside the walls and stayed there. Children were kept where somebody could see them, The whole population of a rich kingdom pulled itself back behind one line of stone and sat there, and the stone held, because it was very good stone. The richest part of the kingdom became a place people looked at from the wall. The bill went out to the whole country. The farmers lost the fields. The families in the streets lost the people in their houses. The fishermen lost the water, and the herdsmen lost the low pasture. On the day the king swore his oath, every one of those people had been outside the hall, or at home, or asleep, or not yet born. Laomedon lost nothing personally. He was inside the strongest wall in the world, eating well, and the wall was doing its job perfectly. It had been built by the same being who was now dismantling everything on the other side of it. Divine punishment reaches the guilty man last. It starts with whoever is standing closest to him and works inward, and it keeps working inward until the cost finally arrives at his own door. So the king did what kings in that position do. He sent to the oracles and asked what would make it stop. The answer came back through the priests, in front of the people who had gathered to hear it. So the whole city knew the terms before the king had finished thinking about them. That detail matters. It put the decision in a room full of witnesses again, and the men in that room had lost far more over the past year than he had. He received an answer, and the answer had a price on it. The gods would take a daughter. In one version, the young women of the city were put to a lot to decide whose child would go. The name that came out was the king's own daughter. Her name was Hesione. Laomedon had a choice at that point, and it is important to be exact about what the choice actually was. He was being asked, one more time, to settle an ordinary commercial debt. The gold was still in his treasury, the sum had not gone up, and no interest had been added, and the two men he owed it to had not come back to renegotiate. Everything that had happened to his kingdom since that afternoon in the hall would have stopped the moment he paid what he had promised. He chose to give them Hesione instead. They took her down to the shore, to the rocks below the level of the fields, and they fastened her there with the water in front of her. There was a procession down, because there is always a procession. It was done properly, because a thing like that is always done properly. People who had known her since she was small carried the things that had to be carried and stood where they were told to stand. Somebody would have been in charge of the timing, and somebody else in charge of the fastenings. Both of them would have done the job carefully, because doing the job carefully is how a person gets through a morning like that without thinking about it. The right people were present, the correct words were said, and somebody checked the fastenings before they left. Then all of them walked back up the path to the city. They went home in the evening up a road they knew well, and the sound of the water behind them got quieter as they climbed. Every one of them could hear what they had left down there. The gate was shut behind them. The wall that Poseidon built kept the city safe that night, exactly as designed. The man who had threatened to tie two workmen hand and foot and put them on a boat had now tied his own child to a rock. Then he went inside for the evening. That is the whole of Laomedon in one image. He would spend anything except the thing he owed. He had been given the same bill 4 times by then, first as a wall, then as a flood, then as a sickness, then as a thing living in his fields. Every time he was asked to pay in gold, he found something else to hand over instead. He gave up the fields, and then the farmers, and then his own child. The gold stayed where it was. There is a reasonable question about why Poseidon accepted the arrangement, and the honest answer is that he had not proposed it. He had put a price on the city, and the city had chosen who would carry it. That is what happens when a debt is left to run. It stops being a number that one man owes and turns into a weather system that everybody underneath it lives in. Hesione was on those rocks for a while, long enough for the situation to become a known fact of that coastline, and for ships to start giving the bay a wide berth. And then, on an ordinary morning, one ship did not give it a wide berth. It came in and put men on the beach. One of them walked up the shoreline until he was standing in front of the rocks, looking at her, working out what he was seeing. He asked whose daughter she was. Then he turned around, went up the road to the city, and told the king he could solve his problem for a price. The man off the ship was Heracles, and he was in the middle of a working life that consisted almost entirely of other people's impossible problems. He came up the road, got himself in front of the throne, and made an offer. He would deal with the thing in the water, and the girl would come off the rocks alive. His price was the horses. Those horses need explaining, because they are the reason this second deal has a shape. Years before any of this, Zeus had taken a boy out of the royal family of Troy. Afterwards, he sent that family a set of mares in compensation. They were the finest animals in the world, and every person in that hall knew exactly what they were and where they had come from. So the payment Heracles asked for was itself a payment, sent down by a god, sitting in the royal stables as the settlement of an older account. Laomedon looked at the man who could save his daughter and agreed to the terms out loud. He did it in the same room where he had sworn the other oath. Heracles went down to the shore and killed it. The record spends almost nothing on that fight, and the outcome is the only part that carries. The thing that had been taking people off the flooded field stopped existing, and the water went quiet. Somebody went down, got Hesione off the rocks, and brought her back up the road. The coast belonged to the city again. Everything that Poseidon had put on that kingdom was, at that moment, over. All of it had cost Laomedon nothing but a promise about some horses. Then he refused to hand them over. He had now done the identical thing twice. To the two kinds of being it is least advisable to do it to. The second refusal was worse than the first, because the first one could at least be put down to greed. The second was a habit. The first refusal had cost his country its harvest, its farmers, and very nearly his own daughter. None of it had reached him personally, and that is the piece of information he took away from the experience. Heracles heard the answer and did not argue. He went back to his ship and put out to sea. Before he went, he told the king what would happen next, and he was specific about it. Then he was gone from that coastline for a while, and Troy went back to normal, and the wall stood there, being the strongest wall in the world. Some years later, the ships came back. They came in at the start of a season, in daylight, with no attempt at surprise at all. The men on the wall counted them and sent the number up to the palace, and the number was so small that the report probably sounded like good news. Troy had survived worse than this. It had survived a flood, a sickness, and a thing living in its own fields, and it had the finest fortification in the world with a full garrison behind it. The oldest account puts the number at 6. 6 ships came against the most heavily fortified city on Earth. The force was small enough that any competent defender could have counted the masts and gone back to bed. Everything about that arithmetic says the attack should have failed at the base of the stonework. It did not fail. The reason was laid into that wall on a hot afternoon a generation earlier, in front of 2 gods and 3 snakes. The first man over was Telamon. He went up at the one stretch that would take a ladder. He was over the top and inside before anybody else in the force had made it, and the city was open behind him. After that it went quickly, in the way a defended city always goes quickly once one man is standing on the wrong side of the wall. The gates stop being the strongest part of the design and become the thing the defenders have to reach in time. Nobody reached them in time. Telamon was the son of Aeacus. The man who laid that section had a son, and the son came back and used it. It happened in the first generation, exactly as it had been read out at the time. Nobody in that assault force was working from a prophecy. Telamon went up at that spot because it was the spot that could be climbed. There is a small human moment right after that, and it survives because it is the kind of thing men remember. Heracles saw that somebody had got in ahead of him and was not pleased about it, and he came at Telamon with his sword out. Telamon, who was quick, started picking up loose stones and stacking them. Asked what he thought he was doing, he said he was building an altar to Heracles, the glorious victor. Heracles put the sword away. 2 men stood in the breach of the wall of Troy and settled the question of precedence with a pile of rocks and a compliment. Inside the city it went the way these things go. Laomedon died there, in his own gates, in the wall he had commissioned and never paid for. His sons died with him, all but one, and the accounts do not linger over any of it. The king who had spent years refusing to give up anything he owned, lost all of it in one afternoon. It went to a raiding party of 6 ships, at the join he had watched being built. Hesione was given to Telamon as a prize of war, And this is where the last piece of it arrives. She was allowed to choose one of the prisoners and take him out of the slavery the rest were going into. Think about the position that puts a person in. She was standing among the survivors of her own household on the day her father and almost all of her brothers had been killed, and she was handed exactly one exemption. Everybody in that group could see her holding it. Whoever she looked at was going to live, and everybody she did not look at was going to be sold, and she had to decide in front of all of them. She chose her little brother, a boy named Podarces, who was the one son of Laomedon still breathing. Heracles set a condition on it, and the condition is the point. The boy had to be a slave first and then be bought properly, with a price paid for him, so that the transaction was real. Hesione took off her veil and handed it over, and that was the price. The child was sold and purchased in the space of a minute, in front of the men who had just sacked his home. He was never called Podarces again. They called him the bought one, and the old account says that is where the name Priam comes from. Every time anyone says the name of the king of Troy for the rest of history, they are saying the sale. So the Troy that the famous war happens to, the city with the towers and the treasury and the great gates, is the second one on that ground. It was raised again by a man who had been sold as a child and bought back for a piece of cloth. It stood behind a wall that had gone up for a wage nobody ever handed over. 2 full generations had now been ruined by one unpaid contract. And the strangest fact in this entire story is that Poseidon still had not been paid. Generations later, the Greek world came across the water for Helen, and the whole fleet beached on a shore that Poseidon had personally flooded once already. He watched the opening of that war from the highest peak of wooded Samothrace, sitting still, with the entire plain laid out under him. From that seat he could see Ida, the city, and the beach with the ships drawn up on it. He sat there long enough for it to be noticed. The Greeks thought they had come to take a city back from a prince who had stolen a wife. Poseidon was looking at something that had been left open since before their grandfathers were born. The men who made the promise were dead. The wall was still standing there in the sunlight. Then he came down and started working for the Greeks. He did it the way he does things, in pieces, without ever announcing whose side he was on or why. He put strength into exhausted men on the beach. He argued with his own brother about the outcome. He came onto the field himself when he judged that the moment allowed it. The ground he stood on made the fighting easier for one army and harder for the other. And once, in the middle of that war, he got a clear run at it, and the way he got it is the best joke in the whole story. Zeus had forbidden the gods to interfere. That order held as long as Zeus was watching the plain, and Hera decided that he was going to stop watching the plain. She prepared herself carefully, borrowed a charm from Aphrodite under a false explanation, and went up to her husband on the peak of Ida. She took sleep with her. Zeus saw his wife arrive looking the way she had arranged to look, and everything else went out of his head. Shortly afterwards, he was unconscious on that mountain with his arms around her. It is the same partnership as the Knight of the Cord. The same wife, working on the same problem, using a method that did not require anybody to hold anything down. Word went to the beach that the sky was not paying attention, and Poseidon took the field. He drove the fighting back off the ships and across the plain. For those few hours, the war ran the way he wanted it to run, and the Trojans were pushed further back than at any point in 10 years. Then Zeus woke up on Ida, and looked down and saw what had been done to his battlefield while his eyes were shut. The order to withdraw came down almost immediately. Poseidon had spent the one clear opening he ever got on a few hours of ground, and he took it without hesitating, and he handed it back when he was told to. He never got another one. Whatever the war was about for everyone else, one of the great powers inside it was there because a man had once refused to pay him for a job. The strangest single episode in the whole war is a piece of wall business, and it goes straight to the middle of him. Partway through the fighting, the Greeks threw up their own defenses across the beach. It was a rampart with towers and a ditch in front of it, put together in a hurry so they could hold the ships. They put it up without sacrificing to anybody first. Poseidon went to Zeus about it, and the complaint he made is not the complaint of a strategist. He said the fame of that Greek rampart would go out over the whole world. People would forget the wall he and Apollo had toiled over for Laomedon. That is what was bothering him. The strongest structure ever raised on that coast was his, built with his hands in the worst year of his life. He had never been paid a coin for it. Now a crowd of soldiers was going to be remembered for a mound of earth they scraped up in an afternoon. He was watching the last thing he had left from that year get overshadowed by amateurs. Zeus told him he could take it down once the Greeks had sailed home, and that permission is the only wage he was ever actually granted for Troy. He collected it in full. The poem stops the war for a moment to say what happened to the Greek rampart after everybody sailed. It is the most complete act of erasure in the literature. Poseidon and Apollo took all the rivers that run off Ida and turned them, every one, and put them at the rampart together. Zeus reigned for 9 days on top of it. Poseidon went in front with the water and swept the foundations out into the sea, all the timbers and the stone the Greeks had piled up. He smoothed the whole shoreline flat with sand afterwards. Then he sent the rivers back to their own channels. The beach looked the way it had always looked, and there was no way to tell that an army had ever camped on it. A god who cannot make a mortal keep his word can at least decide what the coastline will look like when the argument is over. And the wall he had built kept doing exactly what he built it to do. 10 years of the best fighters in the world could not get through it. They tried the walls and gave up on the walls. That is why the ending of that war is remembered as a trick, because nothing else was going to work. When Troy finally went, it went where it had always been going to go. The way in was the stretch a mortal had laid on a hot afternoon in a year of servitude. The prophecy had named the first generation and the fourth, and the first had come and gone with Telamon. The fourth arrived in the shape of the son of Achilles. That made him the great-grandson of Aeacus, coming up over the same low ground his ancestor had built. There is a moment near the end of the fighting when you can see what all of this had cost Poseidon by contrast. He met Apollo on the field, and the two of them had every reason to stand on the same side of that grudge. Poseidon reminded him of the year, the wage, and the way they were sent out of the city. Apollo declined to fight. He said that fighting other gods over the affairs of mortals made no sense. Human beings are here for a season and gone like leaves, and he was not going to trade blows over them. Then he walked away from his own case. One of them let it go, and one of them did not. The whole distance between those two gods sits in that moment. Even Poseidon's mercies in that war ran along the same line. When Achilles had a Trojan prince cornered and about to finish him, Poseidon lifted the man out of the fight and set him down at the edge of it. He had no love for the man and no interest in his family. He did it because that branch of the house was fated to survive and rule the Trojans afterwards. The branch that had to end was the one descended from Laomedon. His own words on that day were that the son of Cronos had come to hate the line of Priam. He carried a bought child's father in his mouth like a verdict, and he saved a stranger in order to make sure the right family died out. So the account closed the way that kind of account closes. The city went down, the line that had cheated him ended, the wall came out of the record, and the beach went back to being a beach. Every person who had stood in the hall on the day of the oath was long dead, and their children were dead as well. The whole thing had been settled twice over. And the anger was still there. It had run out of Trojans to spend itself on, and was still fully loaded. On the night the city burned, it found a new name to attach to. One of the winners was about to sail home the long way. The winners went home separately, the way armies always come apart at the end, and most of them got where they were going. One of them did not. On the way out of that war, a Greek captain named Odysseus put out the eye of a giant on an island. The giant turned out to be a son of Poseidon. The sea took the next 10 years of that man's life in payment. The whole of that pursuit is a separate film and a separate coastline. What matters here is the shape of it, because it is the same shape. Somebody damaged something belonging to the god of the sea, and the god did not shout, and the god did not strike him down on the spot. He simply made sure that the water between that man and everything he loved stopped cooperating. It went on for 10 years. Nobody was punishing that man for the eye, in the way a court punishes an injury. He had taken something that belonged to a god and had sailed off, pleased with himself. The god had all the time in the world and complete control of the surface that man needed to cross. A man sat on a raft in the dark, going backwards, over a debt he probably thought had closed the moment he sailed away from that island. The whole thing started somewhere very small. A king wanted a wall and could not raise one out of his own resources. 2 builders offered him a price he could afford, and he took the deal in front of his own court. That is the entire origin of everything you have watched. There was no curse in it, no prophecy at the start, no old family blood feud, no oracle warning anybody about anything. There was a contract, a completed job, and a payment date. Then one man decided, on the day, that he would rather keep his gold than keep his word. Everything after that is the interest on it. The fields went under salt water. The people in the streets died of a sickness they had no part in causing. Something lived in the drowned farmland and worked it for months. A girl who had done nothing at all sat on a rock by the sea because her father would not open a strongbox. A city was sacked by 6 ships. A king died in his own gateway with his sons around him. A boy was sold and bought back for a piece of cloth, and carried the word for it as his name for the rest of his life. Then the same city, rebuilt, was besieged for 10 years by the whole Greek world. It was taken through the exact stretch of wall the whole thing had been about, and burned. Its royal line was ended on purpose, because a god had decided that branch would not continue. 2 generations, a dynasty, and one of the great cities of the ancient world, all of it downstream of an unpaid invoice. And the strangest part of it is that the bill was never actually settled, at any point, by anybody. No account that survives says the gold laomedon owed for that wall was ever handed to anybody. It was still in that treasury when Heracles came through the gate, and after that it belonged to somebody else, and no god ever received 1 coin of it. Everything Poseidon extracted over those generations was taken instead of the payment, and none of it was the payment. That is the difference between revenge and being paid, and it is why the anger never actually ended. A settled debt closes and stops existing. That is the entire function of paying somebody. A debt that gets punished stays open forever, because the punishment never converts into anything. He drowned a plane. He brought down a city, and he erased a rampart off a beach until the sand looked untouched. At the end of all of it, the sum outstanding read exactly what it had read on the afternoon he walked out of that hall. Which brings this back to the thing at the start, and to the man he could never send an invoice to at all. His own brother put him on that worksite. The poem never says why in so many words, and it never records a punishment for the other 2 who reached for the cord that night. Poseidon and Zeus went on living in the same house afterwards, at the same table, for the rest of time. Neither of them ever mentioned it again in front of anybody who wrote it down. That year was the only sentence ever handed down for the plot against the king of the gods. The one who served it was the strongest of the 3. He served it under a mortal, and the mortal cheated him. Every single thing in this story runs out of that one arrangement. Troy is remembered for a wooden horse and a beautiful woman. The wall it hid behind was raised by a god working off a family sentence. It was finished by a mortal who had been chosen because he could be beaten. It was never paid for by the king who ordered it. The horse only mattered because of where the wall was weak. The wall was weak because of who built that one section. That section exists because a god was sent to a building site by his brother. Pull any one of those threads and the city is still standing. There is a version of this where Laomedon opens his treasury on the afternoon the work is signed off. He pays what he said he would pay, and 2 workmen walk out of his hall with what they earned. In that version, the wall still has a weak section in it because that part was decided above everybody. But nothing else in this story happens. No flood, no sickness, no creature in the fields, no daughter on the rocks, no 6 ships, no sale of a child, no god spending the next several generations working against one family. All of it was avoidable at the price he had already named. There is nothing on that coast now. The plain is farmland again, and the rivers run where Poseidon put them back. The shoreline is the one he smoothed over with sand when he had finished taking the Greek rampart apart. Boats go past it every day, and nobody on board is thinking about any of this. The city is a hill with layers in it, and each layer is a version of the place that ended. People go there and walk over the top of the whole thing in an afternoon, and the guides point at the levels and give them numbers. One of those numbers is the town Laomedon ruled. Another is the town Priam ruled, the one that was bought back with a veil and burned anyway. Somewhere under one of those layers is a course of stone laid by a being who was owed a wage in gold and got nothing. He spent the rest of recorded time making sure that everybody who ever heard the name of that city heard about it. That is what an unpaid promise buys when the person you made it to has no reason to ever forget. There is one more half to that year, and it belongs to the god who served his own sentence on the mountain above the same city. He was cheated by the same king on the same afternoon and did something completely different with it. That story is waiting for you, and it explains a great deal about why Apollo was able to let it go. Thank you for staying to the end of this one.